Chapter 8:16. Luonan's consciousness entered the virtual brain interface once more. 2 days and 1 night of downloading did not bring about too obvious of a change. There was only a new notification pop-up waiting there, covering the information refresh window. The notification said, "Offline test question database download complete." It seriously lacked a sense of ceremony. Luonan was affected by this and was worried about the gravitational problem of the abyss world. He didn't have any special feelings. He directly chose to confirm. The notification pop-up disappeared and the information refresh window behind it appeared. New but familiar characters appeared, initiating verification procedure. Confirming activation of offline test procedure. Owner's genetic data has not been entered into the database. Results are being entered. Overall results fail. If he knew that he had to re-enter the questions, he would have taken advantage of these 2 days to do a few more sets of questions and increase his basic points. Luonan chuckled in his mind. Then he saw the follow-up information continue to roll. Additional question database data pulled out. Determining additional question difficulty as spacetime configuration heaven stairway level 2. Selecting questions. Without any buffer, a clear change appeared in the virtual brain interface. The background of the deep starry sky began to expand. The central virtual brain galaxy seemed to come head-on. Millions and millions of stars shuttled and flowed, then scattered in all directions. It represented a process of drawing closer, enlarging, and focusing. The stars became sparse and felt even more distant. A deep void filled most of his field of vision. But soon, the surface was smeared with a relatively rich color. The main source was a large blazing fireball in the distance. Because the light emitted was too intense, it passed through the diffraction and refraction of certain interstellar matter, forming an enormous warped dynamic facula of light. It blurred the proper spherical shape. A portion of its elongated extension was like a spewing light whip and tongue of flame. It cut across a small portion of his field of vision. And so Luonan knew that he should have entered the range of a certain planetary system. He was able to observe the star's sun from a close distance. While he was still analyzing, his field of vision was completely out of his control. He avoided the powerful light of the star and turned in a different direction. A bit of green vaguely sprouted in the void of that position. It rapidly enlarged in the center of the interface. It had a relatively distinct curved boundary. It was clearly a rapidly expanding planet in his field of vision, and it was brimming with the aura of life. It's like playing a game or watching a movie. Luonan couldn't find the feeling of being tested for a time. But it was a bit lacking to say that he was immersed in the scene. The immersive effect was not as good as virtual reality, and his sensory perception lacked real feedback. He knew very well that he was still on the yacht, transmitting information through space and waiting for the test question to appear. While he was pondering and studying, a series of data quickly popped up at the edge of the interface between the habitable planet and the void. The entire field of vision instantly turned into an information window similar to the cockpit. Visualized dynamic information was distributed in the field of vision in a complex and logically connected graphic pattern. From surface data to in-depth analysis indicators, everything was available. At least in Luonan's eyes this was the case. A lot of the information was filled with symbols and units that he could not understand. They were profound and highly professional, beyond the scope of an intuitive translator like him. If it was a game, the newbie guide was really terrible, but this was a test, the kind that did not bode well. Luonan's scalp was a bit swollen. He was afraid that he would miss out on some important information. He opened his eyes wide and read the decipherable information of the memory information interface in one gulp. And during this process, his field of vision plunged into the atmosphere of the green planet in front of him. The feeling of a game or a movie came again. The image of the planet rotated at an unrealistic high speed, forming a fast-forward effect. At the same time, even more complex information, data, and corresponding analysis diagrams were flung out to the edge of his field of vision. Luonan couldn't keep watching. Luonan waited for the planet's rotation speed to return to normal with great difficulty. Just as he was about to catch his breath and reorganize the structure of information, his passive field of vision was instantly filled with a dynamic image of an explosion. It really was an explosion. What Luonan saw right now was a desperate battlefield. Successive explosions of intense light and raging flames tore apart the primordial greenery and burned half the sky red. Flying targets were shot down every second, and buildings on the ground were destroyed at the same time. Fatal flashes of light and impact crisscrossed between the sky and the ground. Though there was no sound input and it was like a pantomime, this was a war. And at this time, A mission window popped up in an eye-catching position on the cockpit management interface. Compared to the specialized interface that caused people to shrink back, the mission description was quite clear. A high-resolution satellite image locked onto the core region where the flames of war swirled. There was a large base called XX Relay Station. According to the introduction, the complex of buildings on the ground was only a small portion of the base. More facilities were still underground, and the core area was hidden in a special space-time structure that was similar to a demi-plane or a space fault. Luonan was able to understand this even though he guessed it. There were many introductions inside that touched upon more specialized domains. Luonan didn't understand half of it. The majority of the information he didn't understand was skipped. All in all, this base was extremely important. It possessed extremely high strategic value. Whether it was a movie, a game, or a test, all of this was necessary. It didn't hinder the understanding of the questions. Luonan carefully studied the key descriptions. The general meaning of the mission panel was, this was an important base sandwiched between 3 layers. The outermost layer was equipped with a XX defensive space-time barrier. It served as a bunker against external enemies. Could be understood as some sort of enchantment. But right now, the enchantment was on the verge of collapse under the high intensity of the enemy's attacks. Luonan's test question was to take a step further in upgrading the defensive power of the relay station based on the situation of the battlefield and the enemy's strength. He didn't destroy the base's sandwiched 3-layer layout and retain the existing enchantment. The idea of the test was very clear. It was a test of Luonan's space-time configuration design ability. This was a very appropriate test if the questions were examined correctly. Clearly, the Heaven Stairway level of questions were on a completely different level from general knowledge application questions. The practical requirements were extremely high. It was already very close to actual combat. Luonan also discovered during the examination of the questions. Other than the intuitive interface of the cockpit management interface, he could also pull up various design blueprints of the base if he needed them. Geological structure diagrams, construction diagrams, and even the core planar configuration design were all there. Luonan skimmed a few glances. There were also all sorts of changes to the infrastructure and the dynamic losses of war. Everything was there. It was simply excessive. It formed a complete historical chain from the beginning of the base's construction all the way until now. Wasn't this test question designed according to actual combat examples? Perhaps there really did exist such a large-scale base at a certain time in the universe. There was such a war. There was such a node that required the contributions of a certain configuration designer. A sense of history assaulted his senses. Compared to this, the lack of authenticity in the senses was secondary. It was reasonable to say that any examinee would have nothing to say when the background information was given to this degree. All they needed to do was bury their heads in research. But Luonan, who had examined the questions twice, looked at the various data and charts that continuously refreshed on the cockpit management interface. He wanted to close his eyes and let out a long sigh. Perhaps the gentleman or lady who designed the test question had thought of everything. The only thing they hadn't considered was that the examinee participating in the test simply didn't possess the corresponding professional knowledge or even cultural background. Even if they did, they would probably only be able to hang around in the general knowledge circle. It was impossible for them to touch upon the Heaven Stairway level of tests. Luonan was an exception. Once again, it was too professional. It was fine to just look at the basic layout and configuration design of the relay station. After all, Luonan had come into contact with a bit of a similar standard composition method in the virtual brain system. Combined with his solid foundational skills, he was able to delve into it with a vague understanding. He felt that he should know how to do it. It was just that he was unable to find a precise place to start in a short amount of time. But the problem was that the test question clearly stated that this test had to be viewed in conjunction with both sides of the offensive and defensive battle. Luonan was on the defensive side, and the external enemy occupied the offensive side. In other words, the enemy he needed to defend against. What the hell was that? There was a mist fortress that was as enormous as a mountain in the air. It was also an unfathomable mist fortress. Lightning interweaved within it as it expanded and contracted. Every time it flashed violently, it would spit out a swarm of bee-like monsters. Among them were air raiders that were similar to prehistoric pterosaurs. They spat exploding acid balls from their mouths. There were enormous rock monsters that were comparable to heavy cannons. They bombarded with death rays from dozens of kilometers away. There were beetle-like assault swarms that could burn parts of their bodies to forcefully break through boundaries and engage in close combat. And there was also the thing that extended out from the mist fortress. was like a special tentacle. It was indistinct. It pierced through the ground and into the clouds. It could seize the base's facilities and energy at any time. Could even suck combat personnel dry. What was it? Actually, the test system had a label. Every time Luonan's attention was focused on an individual target, the cockpit interface would mark the target's basic information in the form of AR. However, Luonan was unable to understand the concise expression that was composed of professional symbols and measurement units. He looked over and over a few times, but he was only certain that these monsters seemed to be vassals of some fantasy breed. Could it be that it was all an illusion? Luonan understood. Luonan understood. In the eyes of the designer of the test question, the personnel participating in this test certainly possessed the basic knowledge to recognize this type of information. They could obtain comprehensive information from the interface as a reference. The more detailed information was certainly hidden behind professional words and symbols. Perhaps the difficulty of the test question would be completely controllable after integrating and analyzing all the information. But the reality was that Luonan didn't possess this kind of cultural background. The translation function of the secret text of the word, me, was limited. The information was all intermittent. Plus, the lack of the reality of the scene caused Luonan to only be able to use his sight to distinguish. His most proficient mental senses were completely useless. How was he supposed to take the test? Chapter 8:17. Luonan was a bit flustered. Could he exit right now and go back to rummage through the data of the virtual brain system to cram? Clearly he could not. After the test questions were presented, a countdown began on the managed cockpit interface. Luonan was barely able to convert the basic time units of the mysterious civilization after doing a few simulations. From the pulsating rhythm of the scale, he could tell that he only had around 70 minutes of time. Luonan still remembered that the consequences of failing the offline test was that he would not be able to proceed with a second confirmation for a certain period of time. Luonan could only make blind guesses when it came to the measurement of a longer span of time. Months? Years? Or even longer? The more it was like this, the more he couldn't help but consider the most difficult aspects. Because of this, Luonan was exceptionally unable to accept the result of failure. Since he couldn't accept it and he couldn't change it, there was no point in lamenting and regretting. Luonan's ability to translate the secret text was basically like this. It was impossible to improve greatly in a short amount of time. Luonan could only do his utmost to decipher the information from the data and the images. The data was fine. Even if it was static and unable to reflect the changes in battle, Luonan would gain something from reading it a few more times. He would have more ideas. However, the analysis of the battle images was far too unreliable. Luonan's military knowledge was lacking. The only things he had were the basic knowledge he learned from Crag Burst. Moreover, this level of battle had long since surpassed the scope of Earth's military concepts. Luonan strove to look at the soldiers hidden within the various bunkers, facilities, and mobile vehicles of the base. They had humanoid appearances that Luonan naturally felt familiar with. Most of them wore extremely high-end exoskeleton armor. They were a bit similar to Deep Blue Walkers. Each and every one of them moved quickly, controlled stably, and were well trained. However, a considerable portion of their actions did not rely on the weapons in their hands to carry out direct attacks. Often, there would be some sudden, unforeseen attacks and defensive attacks that would erupt within and outside the base. They would appear above and below ground in various areas. At first glance, they didn't seem to conform to the laws of physics, but their destructive power was astonishingly great. This made Luonan think of the Deep Blue Walker's formatting domain. He thought of the Blood Intent Ring Fortress that he had built with his own hands. He also thought of the Soul Order's so-called sanctuary. That's right. There was bound to be a clash and a gamble on the mental plane in this battle. If Luonan were to extrapolate from the current development direction of the Earth, then there would certainly be one or more collectivized, systemized, and solidified configurations on the mental plane that Luonan was unable to perceive. Of course, this was just a guess. No matter how powerful Luonan's soul strength was, no matter how high his mental senses were, it was hard for him to create something from nothing. He could probe the existence of the Sea of Consciousness and even the polar domain of the Abyss region from a simulated scene. He could only flip through the information. Now, not only did he have to look through the blueprints of buildings and wards, he also had to find blueprints of the soldiers' mental solidification. Unfortunately, there is none. It was still the same problem. The person who came up with the question would not consider things that had already become common knowledge. For an army that had already been established, its solidified configuration should have long since become common knowledge. There was no need to reflect it. However, this was already the only entry point that Luonan could exert his strength. Otherwise, what else could he do? The so-called fantasy breed vassal army that blotted out the sky and covered the earth outside of the base. These monsters hid their attacks on the invisible mental plane. There were truly no connections to follow. They became a natural moat that Luonan simply could not cross. Time passed minute by minute, second by second. Luonan bit his lips as he flipped through all the information he could understand. He did enormous and despairing calculations. Algorithms had never been Luonan's forte. When Luonan was forced to this step, it meant that he was truly at his wit's end. Dog's hit. It's all dog's hit. Luonan took nearly an hour to produce the embryonic form of 2 plans. However, they were pieced together results that made him feel nauseous. They were filled with untrustworthy conjectures and fantasies. He didn't even need to submit them. He just needed to do some mental calculations against the battle scenes to prove that they were all trash that could only be of help. He needed to throw them all into the trash bin. Information. Real-time information and information. I don't want anything else. I just want this. Luonan's taut strings of reason buzzed and trembled. He tried to find a thread of order that could resonate within the half-hidden sea of information. This was also a conflict between order and chaos. What Luonan was doing right now was a vast and exquisite balance that was presented by absolute hell and solar chakram of the abyss world. It was simply the distance between one end of the universe and the other. Wait a minute. Why did he suddenly think of that side? Luonan was distracted. His train of thought deviated for no reason. He was clearly struggling within the maelstrom of limited information and infinite chaos, but he inexplicably associated it with the abyss world. He associated it with the solar chakram and absolute hell, mutually conflicting and compromising structures. And it was extraordinarily clear. It was as if it was right before his eyes. Last time he was in such a state. What followed next was a backlash plus heavy injuries. Luonan shuddered. The disadvantages of the non-immersive environment were apparent. He popped out from his focus state and instinctively inspected the state of his body and soul. His body was fine on the yacht. The tree-hole space was still stable at the forefront of his thoughts. The countdown of the administrative cockpit entered a warning orange-yellow zone at this moment. It reminded Luonan that the time for him to hand in his test paper was getting closer and closer. Luonan gritted his teeth. What was he thinking about? He wouldn't die anyway. At worst, he would just make a trip to Claw Island and update himself. And if he failed this test, he would be unable to increase his privileges. It would be difficult to obtain the encrypted information of the external neuron. The impact was secondary. What was truly unacceptable was that he would miss the window to approach the truth. He would have to start another round of unpredictable waiting. He had to choose the lesser of two evils. If the special image of the abyss world could stir the current deadlock, then there was nothing bad about it. Well, it was impossible for Luonan to pin his hopes on another unpredictable factor. He needed to maintain his focus first. Luonan slapped his cheeks heavily with both hands and forced himself to dispel all distracting thoughts. He placed his attention back on the virtual war. The information was still as chaotic as before. His agitation and anxiety were still there. But before he knew it, the heat, in his emotions and the coldness, in his will gradually formed a subtle state of conflict and compromise, just like the conflict between Sunwheel and Hell, and the conflict between the images of high temperature and chains. Between rules and chaos, between reason and emotion, a noose of chains was erected. It endlessly churned and cleansed, maintaining a dangerous yet marvelous dynamic balance. His mind moved and didn't move. It was sharp and clear. The information moved and didn't move. There was order in the chaos. The most important thing was that Luonan suddenly discovered a marvelous phenomenon of mapping from the non-immersive test scene. What he saw in his eyes was still the half-cut information that made him restless. There was no sign of things turning for the better even now. It was impossible for the offline test system to provide deeper information. But there was an inexplicable sense of déjà vu. There were some impressions buried deep within his memories that were stimulated by this chaotic information, slowly emerging. Of course, this was an illusion. The true reason was that there was an even deeper and grander system right next to him in a position that was infinitely close. It was in a completely different state from its previous unfathomable and uncontrollable state. It established a connection with the offline test system and began the orderly output of information and data. The abyss world. To be more precise, it was the sediment that Luonan was unable to absorb and digest when he suffered the backlash of the abyss world. It accumulated within the altar's spiderweb. In a certain sense, this sediment was equivalent to Luonan's own memories. It was just that it was hidden deep within an external storage system that was more complex than the brain. It was simply impossible to dig it out in the past. But now it was activated. The management cockpit continued to pop out analytic graphics without end. Luonan continued to not understand the characters he should not understand. But Luonan was no longer looking at these scribbles. His gaze fell directly on the panoramic battlefield. It fell on the buildings, the soldiers, and the vassal groups or individuals of the fantasy breed. An even more intense feeling of familiarity burst forth. The old-style defensive array. What was it called? I don't remember, but as a solidified configuration, it should look like this. Magnetite mica. This sort of thing is a large-scale soul magnetization storm of soldiers. Pure defense is definitely not enough. I have to take the initiative to interfere. The design of the enchantment. Crap. I don't have enough time. The timer on the management cockpit entered the red zone. Luonan no longer had the chance to carefully comb through it. However, the experience he obtained from the entire battlefield told him that there was no need to worry. This so-called test was nothing more than a seamless connection between many different types of space-time structures, seeking a stable and optimal solution. Of course, Luonan knew this. During his battle with Gongqi a few days ago, especially in the Cavern of the Blood God Ants, the Mist Labyrinth, the Blood Soul Temple, and other domain structures interweaved and mixed together to firmly seal Gongqi within. This was something that had been tested in practice. The structure of the relay station in the topic was a defensive facility. The tightness of the structure was indeed much higher than that of the structures mentioned above. But it was precisely because of its tightness and regularity that the difficulty of Luonan's test was actually a bit lower. Beep. Test time is up. The scene before Luonan's eyes suddenly turned dark. The scribbles on the management cockpit were cleared out. His last impression of the battlefield stopped at the outer perimeter of the relay station. It was the instant the firestorm exploded. The living planets and the model-like stars all disappeared into the distance. Luonan's thoughts returned to the virtual brain interface. A notification pop-up window appeared once more, announcing the test results. This kind of information was quite easy to understand. XX simulation combat test completed. System evaluation, a competent professional. The military's attitude toward you is quite conservative. But blood and fire will help you grow rapidly or die quickly. What kind of score was this? Luckily, the true test results came out. Additional questions offline test result. Pass. Realization of Heaven Stairway waiting. The waiting score is incorporated into the general knowledge test result. Applicable to the 100-year sequence special talent clause. Knowledge access level increased. Confirmation of rights review complete. Rank determination complete. Holders' current privileges, ownership, temporary. Knowledge access, Heaven Stairway level 4, tested. Resource access, sergeant rank, tested. Heaven Abyss network, none, not connected. Opening corresponding privileges to the database. Able to extract design and craft data of lamination interference. Chapter 8:18. It really wasn't easy. The virtual brain system still remembered this young master's original goal. Luonan was a bit stupefied by the series of evaluations and results. He only came back to his senses when he saw the last sentence. He subconsciously let out a sigh of relief. But when he thought about it in detail, he felt a bit unbalanced in his heart. Of the 4 main authorizations, the Heavenly Abyss Network had been disconnected and could be ignored. The remaining 3, knowledge search and resource transfer, had changed from pending detection to detected. Among them, knowledge search had also been upgraded to Celestial Stairway level 4. He did a set of Heaven Stairway level 2 tests and obtained the right to check out Heaven Stairway level 4. It looked pretty good. Bullshit. The core of the test, ownership, didn't change at all from the word to the meaning. He had been tossing and turning for so long, but in the end he was still a temporary owner. Someone could point at his nose and tell him to return the item to its rightful owner at any time? What was the use of this sort of confirmation and review process? Luonan cut a sorry figure during the offline test and finally obtained this kind of result. Luonan was quite vexed. However, Luonan was a good and reasonable child in nature. He knew how to look for reasons from himself for everything. After calming down for a bit, he thought back to the entire test process. It really wasn't all that amazing. The final evaluation he obtained was quite conservative. Reality was reality. No matter what objective factors existed, the test evaluation had its own preset standards. Luonan was unable to reason with the system. Oh, my head hurts. Luonan's mental and physical state began to slide into a low ebb. His results from the low-altitude sweep were just one of the factors. A considerable portion originated from the life-saving mapping during the test. This could be considered a kind of backlash. The amount of information from the sediment was quite large in an instant. Fortunately, it had been washed by the altar's spiderweb, so it was easier to digest than the direct impact of the abyss world. Luonan was a bit regretful. The mapping that was activated during the test formed mostly instant memories. Now that he thought about it, there wasn't much that he could remember. It was a bit like forcefully memorizing a question to pass the test. He had to memorize it in one gulp. He had to come to the question, the situation, and the conditions before he could think of the answer. After the test, everything returned to square one. The sediment continued to precipitate. Perhaps it was waiting for the next stimulus to arrive. After Luonan discovered this, he was unable to inspect his spoils of war. He hurriedly retracted the external neuron and opened up the virtual workspace on the yacht. He took stock of the little bit of memory information that remained. Over half an hour passed. Luonan's head was dizzy and swollen. He looked at the work area again, but the results were few and far between. The relay station was still all right. He had studied the blueprints seriously and had some general ideas. As for the fantasy breed, it was just a fleeting thought. Luonan let out a long and sorrowful sigh. In this way it would be difficult for him to do a review. In other words, he didn't even know where he went wrong. Luonan's obsessive-compulsive disorder flared up. He competed with himself, tossing and turning in the virtual work area until he was exhausted, but he still didn't make any progress. He had been offline for over an hour. That was about the same amount of time he had spent tormenting himself. Unknowingly, it was already dinner time. Snake Tongue carried a dinner plate and quietly walked in. Luonan came to a realization when he saw Snake Tongue's familiar face. The muslin of concealment was still attached to his body. He had yet to return it to Snake Tongue. Also, the data on the stacking interference technique, which had given rise to all of this, was still lying idle in the external neurons database, waiting for him to read it. What a digression. Luonan mocked himself, but things were already like this. He wasn't in a hurry. He saw that the portion on the dinner plate wasn't much, but it looked like the exquisite dishes of Ban City. He really was hungry. He didn't wait for Snake Tongue to finish arranging the food on the plate. He first grabbed a piece of sushi and stuffed it into his mouth. Honestly speaking, he didn't taste much, but the rice ball was quickly digested after entering his stomach. There was a warm and harmonious energy circulating in his stomach. He enjoyed it greatly. It felt similar to the special ingredients of the Xia City branch. It was a nourishing food specially prepared for ability users, but its effects were quite smooth. It was just right for Luonan's current situation. This isn't bad, Luonan praised. He asked in passing, is it suitable for non-ability users to eat? Snake Tongue sat upright in her seat and responded softly, rice is a specialty of Ban City's normal trade market. There are indeed health-preserving products specially supplied to the LRCF investment circle. That's good. I'll be bringing some back to Xia City. Yeah. Snake Tongue bowed in response. She still had a humble and submissive appearance, but perhaps it was because she lacked the disguising effect of the musket of invisibility. She felt that there was a bit more hidden sharpness to her than when she was in Northmont Xuanhuan's state, especially when she lowered her head. The shadows cast by the lamplight just so happened to decorate the lines of her brows and eyes, highlighting her dark and sharp qualities. But it also made her docile and submissive, making her particularly valuable. Of course, this was for Luonan. Luonan's mood suddenly turned for the better by quite a bit. This person, his former enemy, was now his submissive servant. She was clearly a vicious character with a heart like a snake or scorpion, but she was forced to act like this in front of him. Even though she still had pride and schemes deep within her heart, she was like ice shards during the dog days of summer. She couldn't show her face. She couldn't see the light. Luonan could easily knead and knead her as he pleased. He could mobilize her joy and fear. He could dictate her life and death. He could browse through every hidden detail. He could even casually smear on them to see a new round of reactions and transformations. Snake Tongue could only passively adapt until she became accustomed to it. Or she could make changes that Luonan permitted. She had already done quite well. After the conversation in the bathroom, her corrections were very clear. She knew better than to look at the problems on the psychological level. She certainly still had some unwillingness in the depths of her heart. Her unruliness was still there. Her lofty and unyielding character still existed. The more it was like this, the more painful it was, but she was able to obtain an unending stream of strength from it. She still lacked a bit of conscious self-awareness up until now, as well as a method to efficiently utilize it. So much so that she had suffered a lot of torment for no reason. Luonan was unable to help her with this. Frankly speaking, he was quite pleased to see Snake Tongue struggle. Cough. Luonan was a bit unaccustomed to suddenly digging out the dark side of his heart. But in this sort of one-sided situation, there was a marvelous calmness that came from letting oneself fly. In any case, his mood had indeed turned for the better. He removed the veil of invisibility from his face and handed it back to Snake Tongue. He even made a joke in passing. "Your acting skills were all trained on Northmont Xuanhuan, right?" Luonan laughed out loud during Snake Tongue's momentary stillness. He pulled out the information related to the lamination interference technology from the virtual brain system. The information wasn't a huge tome, but its form was quite interesting. It was similar to the amalgamation of an experimental diary and a thesis draft. It was a bit messy for other people, but Luonan had a solid foundation in configuration. He also had the mindset of a researcher. The entire research train of thought was simply moved before his eyes. Even though there were a few uncommon characters inside that he was unable to recognize and translate, it didn't affect the overall situation. Compared to the experience of the offline test, it was simply the difference between heaven and earth. Luonan skimmed through the information and had a preliminary understanding of the context of the entire information. He also quickly grasped the crux of a problem. He raised his eyes and saw that Snake Tongue was just about to leave the room. He shouted, "Wait." Snake Tongue was already Northmont Xuanhuan. She raised her head in a slight daze. Her face was even colder and purer than her original appearance. It intersected with her sinister and malicious image from before, forming a rather large visual impact. Luonan was stunned for a moment before he said, "Stay here. Help me with some experiments." Yeah. According to the information, the veil of concealment and the veil of silence weren't the carriers of the spirit core for lamination interference technology. Instead, they were just extensions. They weren't made of natural materials, nor did they go through any special processing techniques. They were just true lamination interference spirit cores. They were in a semi-energized state, absorbing the energy of the outside world over the years to carry out the transformation of mass and energy. They were paired with a small portion of special raw materials to weave themselves into strange objects. According to the information, Mr. Liang Lu's original intention in creating the spirit core was to conceal his identity. Therefore, the combat power of the entire set of objects wasn't that great. This was especially true for the transformation and interference axis of the spirit core itself. It was precise and relatively fragile. It would often disintegrate in battle, and it couldn't be mass-produced. It could only be made according to the specific state of the lamination layer and the user's situation. It was a test of thought and skill. Liang Lu's self-evaluation also said that the relevant design ideas and techniques were actually a level higher than the evaluation of the work. However, the repeatability of the spirit core was far too poor, so it could only reach the 4th level of the celestial stairway. It was a step away from the title of nobility. It was quite regretful that he couldn't leave his name in the annals of history. Luonan didn't quite understand the background of this technology, but he did understand one thing. The product of lamination interference spirit core was a top-notch concealment equipment. If it was operated properly, the user could even change their characteristics in the mental domain, becoming a completely different person. This kind of ability was seriously overflowing. Wouldn't it be too wasteful to use it purely for concealment? The information also said that as a derivative of the spirit core, the dual muslin and the frame of the body and soul must be highly integrated. Otherwise, the interweaving and changing power would injure the user first. This set a very high requirement for the changes, matching and blending of the user's body and soul structure. The most interesting thing was that the information wasn't limited to the simple pairing of one person and one object. Instead, it was placed on a broader societal level. It researched how to make the characteristics formed by lamination interference approach what kind of person, what kind of person, what kind of standpoint, what kind of person, and what kind of person's faith. This was done in order to obtain the approval of the corresponding circles, to eliminate their vigilance and killing intent. It was simply a teaching syllabus for the study of disguise. Luonan had yet to formally begin, but he already felt that he had learned a lot. At the very least, he knew that the extraterrestrial civilization that Mr. Liang Lu resided in was a complex and turbulent society that could be labeled as a heretic at any time. Luonan also noticed that the information clearly involved the mutual interference of the body and soul, but there wasn't a single word or sentence that involved the word soul strength, mental plane, and the like. The corresponding concepts were all replaced with things like material waves, thought waves, and so on. Translated, this was the meaning. The smell was a bit familiar. Dianhuan? Wasn't this the concept that Dianhuan's order of creation had always emphasized? Chapter 8:19. Warden was the unluckiest person in the world. At least in the 10 days after the 28th of April, Warden firmly believed so. Under the bastard horn demon's terrible ability to control the situation, a routine business investigation suddenly turned into a swing on the line between life and death. The messy arrangements, the baffling traps, the sudden infighting. There were also two almighty extraordinaries who had come from thousands of miles away to attach their souls to him. By the time Warden snapped to his senses, he had already been held hostage in the wilderness laboratory and stayed there for 10 days. 10 days was a very long period of time, especially when there was a lack of water and food. Even a superpower would be done for. Warden was glad that every time he went out on a mission, he would prepare emergency energy bars and water replenishment capsules. Over the past few days, he had been frugal and meticulous with his plans. He had finally managed to survive. As for the others, he had to say that apart from him, there was no normal person in the laboratory. Ignoring the two who were possessed by extraordinary souls, Jingxin and Horn Demon were two dogs in front of a true god. They could live by the whims of others and couldn't be judged by common sense. As for the remaining two, Warden originally wanted to find a sense of superiority. At the very least, he wanted to experience the feeling of being in the same boat. However, the reality dealt him a heavy blow. Saint Anthony probably didn't prepare enough supplies and ran out of food a week ago. However, he had relied on the pure and rich holy light in his body to mutate and adjust his organs. He entered a state of ascetic cultivation and endured it day by day. Although he was nearly 2 times thinner than before he came in, he was still in high spirits without any signs of fatigue. His mind was even clearer. The one with the surname Wan walked around the laboratory every day, constantly gesturing with his composition. If he was tired, he could squeeze out water from the air to replenish his energy. The more Warden saw, the more she suspected that this guy's mouth could automatically produce liquid food and the like, so that he would never have to worry about food shortages. Against these two, be it in terms of willpower or ability, Warden had no choice but to admit defeat. Worst of all, they were silent fellows. They wouldn't say anything for 2 to 3 days, so there was no way for them to communicate. It bored Warden to death. Perhaps he was only suitable to be a commercial spy. However, it was precisely in such an environment that Warden's sense of crisis was increasing day by day under the encirclement of these people. The big fish ate the small fish and the small fish ate the shrimps. This was the ecology of the inner world. He wasn't willing to be someone's dog, and his abilities were a notch lower than others. Once he caused trouble, the outcome that awaited him would most likely not be too good. I have to leave. I have to leave quickly. From the first day he entered the laboratory, Warden had never given up on this idea. He had even thought of more than a dozen plans, but none of them were feasible. The regular way in and out of the laboratory was in the hands of Luoyuan. He had been very easygoing from beginning to end, as if he were there to watch the fun. The question of whether or not to leave the laboratory was completely controlled by the true god. As for the true god, this almighty who could summon the wind and summon the rain outside, he was willing to stay in this small laboratory because he wanted to dig out the mystery within. At least before the East Ocean auction was held on May 16th, he didn't want to waste a single second. How could this be? Moreover, Luoyuan had been saying with a smile that the void environment of the laboratory was unstable. Everyone could be left behind at any time, and it would not be so easy to come in again. Every time he said this, Warden wanted to punch him. He must have done it on purpose to deliberately provoke him. With the mentality of the true god, the more he heard such words, the less likely it was to leave easily. However, the fact was that they had been here for 10 days, and the entire laboratory was like a small bunker with 1,000 piles. It couldn't be more stable. Even if the sudden storm passed through 2 days ago, causing a certain amount of impact damage to the 2 Kelliser-shaped corridors of the laboratory, the main body of the laboratory was as stable as Mount Tai. Not stable at all. But it was also after that storm that the intensity of the true god's experiment suddenly increased to a level. As the key area of the experiment, the observation hall, Warden no longer dared to approach. The safest thing to do now was to find a room that had not been eroded by the sandstorm, and hide in it. But Warden was the kind of person who couldn't stay idle. Just now, he followed Wanta and strolled in the right Kelliser-shaped corridor for a while. In comparison, this man, who was said to be a welfare dean in the secular world, was relatively easy to talk to. In particular, some of the outlines he drew often involved the structure of the laboratory, and perhaps the analysis of this sandstorm outside. Huadian quietly recorded it, ready to go out as his own harvest, to extort more money from the employer. Wanta should be able to detect his behavior of secretly photographing, but he did not stop it, so Huadian took it as his acquiescence. After some photographing and collecting, Wanta closed his eyes and rested there, adjusting his thoughts. Huadian went up to chat with him for a while, but he didn't get the point, so he retreated and walked back along the corridor. Just as he was thinking about where to go, his scalp suddenly went numb. The sound of heavy footsteps came from the front. Because of the curvature, he couldn't see the appearance of the person coming, but his mind had automatically imagined the seemingly sluggish body of the fat dragon. The true god. For 10 days, the true god had been sending his soul to this loyal believer, leading everything in the laboratory. It could be said that he controlled everyone's life and death apart from Luo Yuan. Huadian instinctively didn't wish to meet this person. He turned his gaze and saw that the door to a room in front of him was ajar. It hadn't been eroded by the sandstorm. Without thinking too much, he plunged into the room. When he entered, he suddenly thought of a problem. According to the latest popular cage theory, by the time he discovered the true god, he would probably have been in and out several times. Why bother? Huadian froze at the door as Fat Dragon's body slowly walked past him. He didn't even turn his head, ignoring Huadian's existence. Instead, it was Jingxin who was following behind, who shot a glance over and bared his teeth in amusement, looking very amiable. Damn simp. Huadian didn't have a good impression of Jingxin. This wilderness ecology expert who held a post in the Ability User Association had really embarrassed all the technicians in the world. However, he was still somewhat curious. After the two of them walked over, he even poked his head out to take a look. However, due to the curvature of the corridor, he couldn't see the end. He didn't dare go forward either. After poking his head out a few times, he gave up. It was also at this moment that Huadian suddenly felt that something was amiss. He turned his head and saw that in the corner of the empty room, there was someone sitting on the ground with his back against the wall. He didn't seem to have any energy at all. He was like a lump of meat that had been kneaded and thrown there. The lump of meat could still move. Its only arms slid around the ground and walls as it searched. Sometimes, it would use its nails to forcefully dig out some powder and place it in front of its eyes. Finally, it would lick it with its tongue or even swallow it. Only a horned demon could do such a disgusting thing. Although Horned Demon and Jingxin were the two dogs under the true god's feet, there was actually a difference between dogs. Jingxin was a very competent bootlicker. His only job every day was to serve the true god well. As for the centaur, the initiator of the current situation, after losing an arm, his temperament became more and more weird and gloomy. He did some weird behavior that others couldn't understand. It was appropriate to call him a mad dog. Regardless of what he thought, he had to maintain his dignity. Huadian tried his best to ignore Horned Demon's inhuman actions. The corner of his mouth twitched as he revealed a smile. Sorry, I didn't know there was someone here. Sorry to disturb you. Something's wrong. Horned Demon's hoarse and dry voice sounded. There were only two people in the room, so it was impossible for Huadian to pretend that it was a misunderstanding. He could only turn his head. What? I'm not in the right state. Nonsense. Believe it or not, my anus can see it. Huadian knew that Horned Demon was messing around again. In the past few days, similar situations had happened to him more than once or twice. It was most likely due to the stimulation he received before entering the laboratory that he couldn't resolve. The two transcendents watched coldly, so it was impossible for Huadian to get involved. He was only thinking that he might suddenly be bitten if he was in the same room as Horned Demon. Huadian had the intention to retreat, so he said with a fake smile, "You're still too tired. Rest a little longer. I won't disturb you." With that said, he turned around and left regardless of Horned Demon's reaction. To his surprise, the moment the door opened, he nearly bumped into someone's face again. Holy**Tia? Dr. Jingxin? Jingxin, who had just passed by, was standing outside the door. He was still smiling and looking very friendly. Looking for Horned Demon? He's inside. Huadian didn't want to deal with such a person at all. He nodded and smiled before turning to the side to walk out. However, Jingxin didn't make way for him. It was also at this moment that Horned Demon, who was sitting on the ground, let out a long sigh. He slowly got up and walked over, saying strange words that no one could understand. That's how it should be. At this moment, Huadian was in no mood to decipher it. As a B-rank ability user, the distance between him and Jingxin had seriously exceeded the normal safe distance. If they happened to meet, it wouldn't be a problem for them to cross paths instantly. However, Jingxin stood there without any intention of making way. Then, the words that came out of his mouth made Huadian's heart sink. "Brother Huadian, Lord True God invites you over." "I'm not going." That was Huadian's first reaction, but he didn't have the courage to say those simple words. In that instant, the horned demon behind him swayed as he followed, forming a pincer attack with Jingxin. Furthermore, in the air that he couldn't see or sense clearly, there might be a pair of invisible eyes coldly watching him. Huadian gulped a mouthful of saliva. The effects of the rejuvenation capsule seemed to have passed. His throat was so dry that he even cracked his first voice. Okay. Chapter 820. Huadian hated that the corridor was too short. Before he could sort out the situation in his shocked brain, Fatty Dragon's back was already in front of him. The only thing that comforted him was that he had just remembered that Wanta was also here. He had been pondering over the composition at the end of the corridor all this time. If a true god came, the two sides would definitely bump into each other. Huadian then realized that there were already 5 people gathered at the end of the corridor. Aside from Luo Yuan and Anthony, everyone else in the laboratory was here. The true god was in charge of everything, and the focus was. Huadian's eyelids twitched. The further he got from the end of the corridor, the worse he felt. A slight flow of air that shouldn't have appeared brushed past his cheeks, evoking a certain memory in the depths of his heart. He subconsciously turned his left wrist, but he still felt that it wasn't enough. He used his other hand to touch it, but all he felt was skin, flesh, and bone. 10 days ago, when he first arrived at the laboratory, there was a wristwatch on it. It was just that the guide Luo Yuan took it off and threw it into. Huadian stopped. The true god and Wanta were conversing in front of him. The effect is okay, right? It didn't completely block the infiltration. The storm 2 days ago caused some changes in the environment. It's fine as long as it's more or less useful. We can adjust and correct it later. The effect isn't obvious. Let's verify it first, then come to a conclusion. I see that you've been researching for the past few days. You came from Xia City. You and Luo Nan often communicate on composition design? Very little. Our communication is more on the use of the brain and the construction of thought and logic. Your relationship isn't bad, huh? It is. From Huadian's point of view, the conversation between the two seemed to be spontaneous and flowed naturally, but there was tension and coldness seeping through it. If Huadian was purely a bystander, he would be happy to analyze it in detail. But right now, Jingxin was staring at him with a fake smile, forcing him to move forward. Huadian's heart was filled with ominous clouds. Up ahead, at the end of the corridor, there was an even more eye-catching scene aside from the two conversing. The metal door that led to the so-called tree hole was open. Huadian felt his scalp tingle as he subconsciously retreated. Jingxin coughed beside him, wanting to warn him. At this time, Fat Dragon had already turned around. His face was stiff, but his eyes shone with the brilliance of a true god. When the bright light shone on him, Huadian's body froze on the spot, motionless. Something's not right. The centaur on the other side was confused again. As he muttered, he picked some powder from the wall of the corridor next to him. This time he didn't lick it into his mouth, but he held it in front of his eyes in a daze. Shut up. The true god's gaze was still on Huadian. He only used Fat Dragon's mouth to reprimand the centaur. The centaur didn't react, but he stopped talking. The true god did not play any tricks and immediately said to Hua, "You, go to the door." When she heard this order, Huadian was already a little desensitized. Her emotions were in a mess, but her mind was surprisingly clear. The big fish ate the small fish and the small fish ate the shrimp. They were finally going to make their move. Then fear surged in his heart. Hey, there's no need to make a fuss. Beside him, Jingxin slapped him on the shoulder and interrupted him. He even took on an unprecedentedly intimate attitude. It's just an experiment, just my ass. Huadian instinctively reacted and wanted to elbow back. However, just as this instinct was about to be triggered, it froze under the true god's cold gaze. Jingxin was certain that Huadian had already lost his resistance. He casually hugged Huadian's stiff shoulders and persuaded him like a good buddy, "Calm down. You cannot believe in your strength and luck, but you can't doubt His Excellency's abilities. Look, we've already made sufficient preparations here. All you need to do is verify it. Walk in and walk out. It's that simple." Perhaps because he hadn't spoken to his heart's content in a long time, Jingxin's chatterbox trait seemed to be on the verge of erupting. Don't ask why we aren't going. Everyone will understand. Besides, you're the only professional spy here. Come use your specialty. Go to that tree hole and observe carefully. Tell His Excellency the results. As for the remuneration, it will definitely be enough. His incessant chatter finally attracted the true god's gaze. Jingxin's voice came to an abrupt halt, afraid that he would incur the true god's displeasure and enter the tree hole exploration list at the last minute. He began carrying out his true mission. He grabbed the back of Hua Dian's neck and hooked him forward with all his might. What you're doing is too much. Wan Ta's voice sounded beside Fat Dragon. The true god's reaction was calm. Say something useful. After a living being enters the tree hole, you need to know the effects it will cause and how to adjust. In his heart, Wan Ta was a technician who could help him. However, Wan Ta's reaction was even more direct. He turned around and walked away, arriving beside Hua Dian in 2 steps. In passing, he smacked Jingxin's arm away. The latter never expected such a situation to occur as his arm slipped from Hua Dian's shoulder. Wan Ta gestured to Hua Dian. Let's go. Hua Dian stood motionless, his mind still in a daze. Jingxin's eyes nearly popped out as he bellowed, "Who dares move?" Wan Ta reached out to grab Hua Dian's arm and continued forward. Hua Dian finally snapped to his senses. His aura, which had been repressed by the true god, came to life as he began exerting strength from his feet. But at that moment he clearly saw Fat Dragon's muscular body distort at the end of the corridor. In fact, what was being distorted was the air and perception. Then the distorting force was used on Hua Dian and Wan Ta. A muffled explosion sounded in the corridor as Wan Ta's body slammed into the wall. The back of Hua Dian's head hit the ground. Even Jingxin was pushed 3 to 5 meters away as he slammed into the curved corner of the corridor. On the other hand, the horned demon didn't care about what happened here. He headed straight for the true god and happened to avoid the frontal assault. At that moment, he stopped and turned his head curiously. No matter what, Hua Dian was still a B rank. His previous reaction wasn't up to standard, mainly because he was being suppressed by the true god. Now that he had hit his head on the ground, he was completely clear-headed. It was time to risk his life. The few plans that he had been pondering over the past few days flashed through his mind, but in the end, he reacted instinctively. He exerted strength in his legs and shoulders at the same time, his body sticking close to the ground as he slid backward at high speeds. Soft sounds of sonic booms rang out as 7 bone talismans shot into the air. These bone talismans were said to be props made by a certain transcendent. After Hua Dian bought them at a high price, he had been keeping them close to his body. Every time he used one he would feel the heartache for days. But now he was throwing them out as though they were free. High frequency, high pressure, and highly chaotic impacts exploded one after another. The external physical impact was secondary. A considerable portion of it was used on the mental level. It connected to the illusory abyss to summon a storm with greater destructive power. Whoosh! It was as though a gale had passed through the corridor, emitting a muffled howl that caused one's blood to sink. Some of these bone talismans killed indiscriminately. Hua Dian was also affected, so he couldn't figure out the changes in the outside world. He didn't hope to injure the true god. All he wanted was to cause the laboratory space to tremble. Also, according to his observations over the past few days, there was an area similar to the one that swallowed his wristwatch. Past the corner, the second door. I'll take a gamble. Hua Dian had already slid past Jingxin. The latter was struck by the abyss storm summoned by the bone talisman. His reaction was a beat too slow, preventing him from intercepting him. Hua Dian's shoulder brushed against the corner wall, but he didn't slow down at all. The locked door was right in front of him. His heart stirred, and just as he was about to jump up, his chest suddenly felt stuffy and hot. Then there was a muffled sound of his sternum collapsing. It was said that the carrier he had attached his soul to had exhausted its potential, and the genetic level had begun to collapse. In any case, it was only a temporary item, so Luo Yuan didn't care. He also stopped beside Hua Dian and looked at the scene in the corridor. He sighed softly. This scene. The 7 of them gathered together again, and the atmosphere was terrible. Under Anthony's treatment, Hua Dian's consciousness recovered. He knew that only Luo Yuan, who was also an extraordinary, was qualified to adjust the situation. He wanted to ask for help, but the blood in his throat surged up first. It gurgled and drowned out his voice. Anthony frowned and exerted a little more strength. Hua Dian coughed out another mouthful of blood and stared at Luo Yuan. All his words converged into the most primitive word, help. Luo Yuan shook his head slightly and didn't give a response. He only sighed with emotion. It's already not bad that it can last until now. It's very normal now. The true god opposite him directly refuted. At that moment, everything in the laboratory was under his control. He slowly compressed Myriad Pagoda's defensive space and gradually erased the possibility of its rebound. At the same time he gestured to Jingxin, who was at the corner of the arc, to bring Huadian over. Finally he spoke in a warning tone, "Everything is under control. Control my ass." A voice that sounded a little out of tune exploded next to Fat Dragon, who was controlled by the true god. A step earlier than the sound wave, a heavy kick aimed straight at Fat Dragon's waist. Before the true god's emotions could be completely projected onto Fat Dragon's face, his body had already left the ground. He smashed through the open door behind him and fell into the half-destroyed tree hole. A muffled explosion sounded, and the void trembled. Chapter 821. The scene in front of him went from light to darkness, then from darkness to light, from the distorted laboratory environment to the illogical sandstorm fragments, then to the familiar sky and land. Finally, there were turbid water waves and bitter liquid that poured into his mouth and nose. Huadian floated in the water. His chest and abdomen seemed to have been splashed with sulfuric acid. He was in so much pain that his hands and feet twitched. He couldn't stop coughing, bringing out the blood in his lungs and salty water in his esophagus and trachea. The current pain, as well as the possible fatal infection and injury that followed, consumed most of his energy. His mind was also in a mess, but as long as the last scene in the laboratory continued to flash in his mind, Huadian's future days could be lived with a smile. Awesome, it's awesome. To think that a true god would have such a day. At that moment, the true god and Fat Dragon, whose soul was attached to them, were kicked into the treehole's ruins by the crazy horned demon. As it turned out, Jingxin's words couldn't be trusted at all. What adequate preparation? It was just a pile of dog shit. At that moment, the true god personally swallowed it. Ayaya, to think that Fat Dragon was in between. What a pity. Of course, it was impossible for the true god to swallow his sh*t. The moment he fell into the tree hole or even the sandstorm, a mental storm erupted and swept through the entire laboratory. The scene of Luo Yuan's prophecy came as scheduled. The void structure of the laboratory was distorted and leaking everywhere. A large number of cracks expelled everyone present into the unfathomable void crevice. Huadian still remembered that Luo Yuan had mentioned a few unlucky people who shared the same fate as him. From the current situation he was considered one of the luckier ones among his kind. After being ejected from the laboratory, he followed an incomprehensible tunnel, and passed through the void barrier, returning to the familiar Earth spacetime. Furthermore, he fell into a plateau saltwater lake, reducing the impact. There was no need to consider radiation pollution for the time being. Bam! There was a dull sound of water beside him. Someone was a step behind Huadian and crashed into the saltwater lake. They quickly discovered him and reached out to pull him up by the shoulder. Huadian was shocked at first, but when he rolled his eyes and barely recognized the person's silhouette, he relaxed and complained vaguely, "You almost killed me just now." The other party didn't respond. Huadian was carried ashore and lay in the mud on the shore. Then, the other party ignored him. "Do you have to be so ruthless?" Huadian's throat was foaming with dirty water and blood, and her vision was blurred. She only saw the man standing by the shore of the lake, reaching out his hand to confirm the position of the setting sun. Then he gestured in the air with an incomprehensible pattern, continuing his usual practice in the laboratory as if he was calculating something. "Hey Wanta Din Wan, someone is really going to die here." Several seconds later, Vanta, who had finished some calculations, finally responded, "Anthony's emergency response is very good. When I pulled you up, I also performed bone setting and partial coagulation for you with the help of the buoyancy of the water. You won't die." It's true. Huadian also noticed that when he was first injured, it was difficult for him to even speak. He felt as if his heart and lungs had been destroyed by the inverted sternum. But now, other than being infected, everything seemed to be fine. He swallowed a mouthful of blood and said, "Thank you." This time it was a sincere reply. Not for anything else but for Wanta's previous stance. It would be better if they could be more harmonious in the form. Wanta's attitude did not change because of a "thank you." He looked calm and squatted down to check the restoration of Huadian's sternum. "It's okay for now, but it's still very dangerous if we have to travel long distances. Do you have anyone to help? If my team is patient enough, contact them. It's best if they can arrive quickly." If I'm not wrong, we were randomly projected within a radius of more than 70 kilometers, which is not far from each other. The true god is a bit embarrassed at the moment, but mainly because Fat Dragon is trapped in this sandstorm, and he doesn't want to lose such a high-quality believer. Once we slow down, we probably won't be able to escape. F***CK. Warden immediately operated the communicator and established contact with his team. Fortunately, he had a good character. The communication was quickly connected, and both sides confirmed each other's position. It will take at least 40 minutes for them to send the shuttle over. It will take longer if they fly covertly. Wanta replied with an "oh," and did not show much emotion. He did not care about the muddy environment of the lake and sat next to Huadian. "Lend me your communicator. My communicator is broken." Huadian quickly handed over the communicator and unlocked the permission. "Just use it. Do you have anyone to help you? Can it be faster?" "No, it's not that. At present, we can only rely on probability. Then, I just want to send some information to the person who should know the most." Huadian did not understand at first. When he came back to his senses, Wanta had already sent the message and threw the communicator back. "Hey, you are not sending it to Professor Luo, are you?" Wanta did not answer, but Huadian already knew the answer. He felt pain in his chest again. If this message is sent, the auction on the high seas will collapse in the blink of an eye. "Do you know that?" Wanta did not respond. Huadian was about to say something, but suddenly remembered that even the true god could not find the hidden location of the laboratory. Only former members like Luo Yuan could distinguish it. What's the use of sending the approximate location? Or could it be that Wanta could accurately locate it? If so, how did he determine the location of the laboratory? Huadian's mind was in a mess. It was meaningless to stop him, but his thoughts were not clear enough to get to the bottom of it. In the end, he could only sigh. "Screw you. This is not a good place anyway. I can stop my employer from investing blindly and prevent him from getting involved in the resources that the Amaterasu cult is determined to get. He should give me a bonus for that alone. Use my communicator. If Professor Luo Jr. comes back, I can also establish contact with him. What I saw in the laboratory over the past 10 days might be able to be sold for a good price." Wanta finally said, "For every word you speak less, your recovery time will be shortened by an hour." Haha, I was also a man of few words in the past. It must have been infected by that simp Jingxin. Huadian obviously knew her body's condition, but her tense heartstrings and the pressure that continued to rise could only be alleviated through nagging. After all, he was facing an extraordinary, and not just one. This transaction could be said to be a huge loss. It was a huge blow to his business contacts. In the future, all his business in Ban City would probably be abandoned. Huadian was annoyed. He shut his mouth and eyes and worked hard to regulate his breathing and heart function. However, there was still a question lingering in his mind that was difficult to solve. Who was it? After surviving a disaster, Huadian's mind became more and more clear. He could be sure of one thing. No matter how bad the situation was, the centaur would not kick the true god's ass. The fact that it was out of the norm most likely had a reasonable hidden link to play a role in private. Thinking of the centaur's recent bad state, and the way the two extraordinary Luo Yuan and the true god came, Huadian made a logical inference, which made his heart twitch again. Hey Dinwan, could it be that in addition to the true god and Luo Yuan, there is another involved? It was almost the same method, but it was more subtle and traceless. Was he thinking too much? Wanta did not discuss this topic with him. He lowered his head to help Huadian knead and deal with the organ tissue in his chest and abdomen. It was a pure physical technique, but it was very sophisticated. Huadian's groaning was very useful. Gradually, his mind was a little scattered and he no longer used his brain. After a few minutes, Wanta suddenly stopped. To be more precise, he moved his hand to Huadian's mouth and nose and gently covered it. Huadian, who originally closed his eyes to enjoy, suddenly opened his eyes. He was also alert. Without any nonsense, he endured the pain, held his breath, restrained his breath, and only treated himself as a dead man. Only his eyeballs rolled around, trying to figure out the direction of Wanta's attention from his face. Huadian's observation was not successful. It was because he had been ejected here before, and he had no concept of the surrounding environment. The range of his spiritual sensing was obviously far from Wanta's. The corresponding observation was meaningless, and it could only make himself more and more confused. However, Huadian had the most basic understanding. In the group of people in the laboratory, there were only two, no, maybe three extraordinary who could be treated seriously by Wanta. Which one would it be? A few seconds later, Warden heard some kind of trembling sound wave, which spread unscrupulously on the barren plateau. Because the distance was relatively far, the distortion was very serious, but judging from the rhythm of the breath, it should be laughter, completely unrestrained laughter. For an experienced spy, reasoning and judgment were basic skills. In a few seconds, the faces and personalities of the remaining 5 people in the laboratory went through in his mind, and the basic judgment became clear. Horned demon, only that crazy horned demon would let out such a laugh. However, it was no longer accurate to call him a centaur now. God knows what kind of big shot was hiding behind this madman. Fortunately, it was not the worst result. Less than 10 seconds after this thought flashed in his mind, Warden suddenly felt dizzy. The bright light from the unknown side, like the parallel suns on the Fusang divine tree, penetrated through the layers of void, making the originally thick and insurmountable barrier become illusory and fragile, collapsing with a touch. From Warden's angle of looking up at the sky, he could see that the clear sky was suddenly covered with a layer of haze. It was a shadow hand that distorted and expanded in the complex light environment. Warden could not observe and understand the void dimension, and it slapped down. The light and shadow outline of the natural time and space distorted and melted at this moment, and there was a feeling of the sky collapsing. True God. Chapter 822. Aha, this kick is really cool. I've been unhappy with him for a long time. Who are you? Who are you? I've caught you. I've caught you. Under the red sun, the centaur staggered across the wasteland. He suddenly shouted and suddenly laughed. His mouth was still spitting out some illogical words. The current centaur was a madman. But at the same time he was also a genius. Luonan quietly observed and determined the nature of the centaur from thousands of kilometers away. The centaur was indeed a genius. His senses on the mental plane were extremely sharp, and he possessed his own logic. He was able to discover subtleties that were difficult for ordinary people to understand from unexpected angles. He tasted the soil, mud, and powder. He started from the perception of the material and connected to a broader level of information. Luonan was still unable to understand the inconceivable aspects. It was no wonder that he was personally recommended by Old Yu despite his eccentric personality. He was one of the people with the greatest potential on the mental side of the Xia City branch. However, success came from geniuses. Failure came from geniuses. The current situation of the centaur was due to the backlash of his talent. Because of his keen perception, he was able to feel the infiltration of Luonan's consciousness. He captured the traces of Luonan's existence and instinctively sensed the danger. Especially at the moment when he kicked down the true god in the laboratory. This unconventional operation had already exceeded the scope of psychological suggestion. It was completed by Luonan's forceful control, thus exposing even more traces. While the space of the laboratory was turbulent, the centaur relied on his talent and his unique sense of smell to trace back and form some sort of spying. The originally one-way conductive line became two-way. This was a fatal link. Compared to Luonan's level, the centaur was still far behind. Luonan's soul cloak, the multi-layered void interweaved in the sandwich domain, and the altar spider web that had just precipitated a huge amount of information from the abyss world. For the centaur, this entire mental plane structure was equivalent to a small abyss world. It was far beyond the scope of his understanding. Unfortunately, he still forcefully wanted to spy and analyze it. It was tantamount to opening the last throttle. A huge flow of information came crashing down. Luonan had already penetrated his mental defenses into 1,000 holes. He could not withstand the impact of the backlash no matter what. Moreover, centaurs didn't have an altar spider web, so there was no possibility of buffer precipitation. Under the impact of the terrifying information flow, the horned demon's mind domain, which had its own logic and rules, shattered like an eggshell. He's done for. Luonan was certain that the self-logic system of the horned demon had short-circuited and completely crashed. What he had done, what Luonan had manipulated him to do, and his own desires and delusions. They were completely mixed together. Truth and falsehood were unknown. Inside and outside were inseparable. They polluted and degenerated each other. The old order had been destroyed, and there was no possibility of a new order being established. So the centaur went crazy. If I can't handle it, I'll probably end up like this too. Luonan was deeply moved, but there was more lingering fear. Perhaps he was only a step away from this state of insanity. One step away, Luonan seemed to understand something. He stood firm and didn't take that step, but the fate of others like the centaur was already clear. For example, Grandpa? Once a thought sprouted, it couldn't be stopped and extended to a deeper level. Right at this time, a shadow appeared from behind the void, suppressing over. True God, seems to be really angry. Nonsense. Perhaps the true God who was kicked into the mist maze was in a difficult situation for a moment. But at his level, the matter of locating a location in the void was nothing difficult for him. Luonan didn't want the true God to stay in the mist maze for too long. In any case, the true God relied on a unique method to anchor the horned demon. He used the horned demon as a fulcrum, intending to travel through space and kill his way over. Luonan would certainly refuse. Just get the hell back to Ban City? Using the horned demon as a medium, Luonan's soul strength was teleported through space. It pierced the void barrier that was as fragile as a piece of thin paper. The wrestling situation between the two sides took shape in an instant. The true God was fiercer in terms of momentum. The shadow that diffused behind the void displayed the multi-layered and multi-angle effects of the propping mulberry tree's great divine treasure. The depths of the shadow contained a flourishing and blazing power like the sun. Once the true form was exposed, the powerful explosive killing power would pour down from the abyss and sweep through everything. It would be invincible. Luonan was on the defensive. There was a bit of a gap in cultivation compared to the veteran extraordinaries, but the most important problem was that the horned demon was far too inefficient as a medium. Its mental state had already collapsed and it had become a bad conductor. From time to time, there would be abnormal electrical resistance, and it greatly affected Luonan's control. The shadow had already penetrated the void barrier. It was like a dense shade under the sun. Dots and lines interweaved and scattered. Occasionally, the gap that had yet to be closed would reflect the sharpness of the sun's sharp blade. There were a few gaps on the horned demon's body. Just a slight drop would cause the skin to split open and flesh to split open. Caught you. The true God's telepathic thoughts were even more intense than the sun. He was speaking to the horned demon, but the sharpness of the telepathic thoughts was clearly piercing deeper into the mental domain. What to do? Then, a thought suddenly popped up in Luonan's mind. Using soul magnetization is just right. What the hell was that again? Luonan was absent-minded for a moment. Finally, his memories from some time ago were particularly deep. He quickly locked onto the corresponding region. The so-called soul magnetization was a certain scene from the external neurons offline test. The strange thing was that this method did not come from the relay station that Luonan had been researching and pondering about all this time. Instead, it came from his opposite, the vassal of the fantasy breed. Luonan had some impressions of it, but it was absolutely not as clear and deep as it was now. The information deposited in the abyss world has been activated. This was the only reason Luonan received. He was unable to analyze it in depth. The true God's power had already broken through the world and entered. Luonan brought out the power of the propping mulberry tree's great divine treasure without holding anything back. The power firmly locked onto the horned demon, piercing through the horned demon's fleshly shell. Luonan attempted to invade the mental plane and trace back to its roots. Luonan needed to organize a solid defense. Then let's do it. The altar's spiderweb seemed to tremble and ripple slightly. Rich and detailed information poured into Luonan's mind with this slight movement. The details of the scene from the offline test were so clear and precise that Luonan did not need to analyze it. He just needed to draw a ladle from the gourd. Luonan was able to realize an extremely similar effect. It was at this very moment that dark clouds and thunder appeared out of thin air outside of the true God's giant shadow palm and the sunlight blade under the high plateau sky. The scale was far inferior to the scene from the offline test, but the necessary methods were not lacking in the slightest. Lightning curled around the horned demon's body, and mist spread out. The dual power that came from the material plane and the mental plane forcefully brushed down, distorting and even completely changing the structure of the horned demon's body and soul. Luonan's consciousness seemed to be assimilated with the mountain range of clouds in the test scene amidst his daze. They were indistinguishable from each other. Luonan clearly analyzed the marvels of its internal operation, slightly changing the scene, and efficiently using it on this side of the world. The horned demon howled in pain and struggled instinctively. The old and new wounds on its body burst open. It was a tragic sight to behold. But this bit of resistance no longer possessed any practical meaning under the effects of this power that exceeded the scope of his understanding. Mist filled the air, thunder rumbled and lightning flashed. The horned demon's figure dissipated within the lightning, and then it was reborn. It was also at this moment that Luonan truly realized complete control over the horned demon. There was no longer any obstruction between the two. On the wasteland, the horned demon suddenly raised his head to face the piercing sunlight blade. On the mental plane, it pierced through the layers of the void, forming a connection and collision with the gaze of the true god. A continuous stream of lightning and fire burned through the void barrier in an instant. But then it shuttled back and forth, performing the most exquisite of repairs and stitches amidst the chaotic and pervasive cloud of fragmented smoke. The void was destroyed and reborn with it. A new structure was erected behind the front line of the void. It advanced, merged, and corrected. Layer upon layer, it gradually solidified the void gap. This method was a reference to the offline test scene. It was the transit station's defense project of the space-time barrier. From Luonan's perspective, this was a matter of course. The situation stabilized a bit, but it was destined to be a bitter battle. Of course, this was not Luonan's first time fighting against an extraordinary, but he had never experienced losing and then forcefully turning the tables. He was a bit excited. He made preparations for a long stalemate and confrontation. But at this moment, the true god's reaction exceeded his expectations. A short and undulating syllable penetrated over. Asterisk. Forgive Luonan. He didn't understand what this meant at all. This shouldn't be any language from Earth. Otherwise, the built-in language system of Luonan's AI would certainly have done a good job of marking and translating. But on the other hand, the division of syllables and rhythm of the sentence had a strong sense of familiarity, rising and falling in a chaotic sense of contradiction. After bobbing up and down several times, the secret me character symbol suppressed within the core of Luonan's consciousness suddenly shone with great radiance. It illuminated his mind, and it combed through the string of syllables once more, forming the meaning of reality. Soul magnetization. The meaning was synchronized, but the special way of expressing it made Luonan's heart tremble with fear. The true god on the other side felt that it should be about the same. The true god's oppressive power suddenly shrunk back amidst this atmosphere. It broke away from Luonan and quickly vanished into the void, leaving not a trace behind. The wasteland returned to its previous appearance. Only the centaur, an outsider, nailed his body to the wasteland. The setting sun shone on his back, forming a long shadow. There was always an end to the shadow, but the horrified emotions in Luonan's mind continued to extend outwards. He wanted to grasp some of the mysteries, but he was still lacking by a thread. At this moment, the external neuron vibrated. Chapter 823. No matter the time, the external neuron's movements were always at the forefront of Luonan's mind. Now it was even more sensitive. Even though the reaction of a true god and the state of the horned demon were worth pondering, Luonan still temporarily withdrew his thoughts from the wilderness. He focused on the virtual brain interface and quickly scanned it twice. There was clearly a prompt response, but there was no definite information. Luonan rarely saw this sort of situation. He did not dare to be negligent. He examined the virtual brain interface with all his concentration. He hated that he could not search the central region where the myriad stars converged. Fortunately, he had not reached this stage yet. He was able to capture the source of the change. It was one of the two large satellites in the periphery of the central virtual brain galaxy. It was the outer space flying ship that had always been in a state of isolation. Since there was nothing to dig up, Luonan had subconsciously overlooked it in the past. But ever since he officially came into contact with the abyss world, aside from the extreme structure of balance between order and chaos and the corresponding backlash power, the thing that gave Luonan the deepest impression was the solitary floating in the periphery of the abyss. It seemed as if the flying ship could collapse at any time. One was inside and one was outside. One was far and one was near. But the impression it gave others was carved from the same mold. Luonan could not help but suspect that there was a close relationship between the two. Right now, the outer space flying ship was still in a state of isolation. It was far from comparable to the exoskeleton armor on the other side. But when Luonan focused his thoughts and observed carefully, the flying ship, which had always been in an unreadable state, lit up a certain region in the middle of the ship's hull. The specks of light there were distributed in chunks. There was a dizzying effect, but it was more transparent. The light from the inside of the flying ship seeped out. It was as if the facilities and equipment in that region had been connected to an energy source. The program had been activated, and it began to hum and operate. Luonan's thoughts probed over, and they really did enter. The unreadable state of the outer space flying ship became history. It opened up certain privileges to Luonan. When Luonan's thoughts cut in, they were limited to the electrified region. There were no more obstructions. He could feel a large amount of precise and complex structures. It was as if it truly existed. It was a high-end ship that could travel in space. It was just that it was in a mini form. And it was precisely because it was mini that the degree of precision of certain regions had exceeded the precision limits of Luo Nan's mental perception under the situation of being shrunk proportionally. It was as if a layer of dense fog was wrapped around it, making it hard to see too clearly. In this indescribably tiny space, in this state of precision and fuzziness, there was a piece of equipment. It was being displayed on the bright screen. There was a display interface on the device, on which an extremely tiny trajectory module was flashing. It looked familiar. Luo Nan pushed his microscopic perception to the limit, and he finally recognized it. Wasn't this the offline test he had just passed not long ago? Wasn't this the scalp-numbing and complicated management cockpit interface? Luo Nan would be able to recognize it even if it had shrunk by 100 or 1,000 times. The interface flashed silently. It was still in a relatively simple initial stage, and it seemed to be inviting him to enter again. Luo Nan really did cast his telepathy over, but the result he obtained was system loading external data, offline testing function maintenance. External information? Was it referring to external information like soul magnetization? Was it an established process or was there some kind of stimulation? It was most likely the latter. Luo Nan recalled the contents of the flash of inspiration when he fought with a true god. Of course, there was also the earlier process of offline testing, the information input process that helped him solve his problems. They all came from the precipitated information of the altar spiderweb, but in the end they still came from the abyss world. The external neuron didn't refuse anything. Or perhaps this was its method of analyzing information from the abyss world. Luo Nan could basically determine the close relationship between the external neuron and the airship at the edge of the abyss, from the external neuron's internal and external reflections, from the sending and receiving modes of the signal waves. But he still needed to observe the relationship between Team 1 and the abyss world. At the very least, he needed to see what kind of changes would occur after the so-called functional maintenance. Returning to a more realistic level, Luo Nan thought about the subtle evaluation he had obtained and the high probability of his low flying score. Frankly speaking, he was a bit unconvinced. If he could do it all over again, that would be pretty good. Basically, Luo Nan viewed this change as a positive trend. All that was left was to wait. He let out a breath and his thoughts returned to the wasteland. The horned demon, who had just been cleansed by the soul magnetization, stood there quietly. It was no longer insane, but it was like a wooden stake. It was as if it had become an empty shell. Had it been formatted? Luo Nan imitated it and used the soul magnetization technique. He really didn't know what the consequences would be. He probingly entered the mental plane of the horned demon and felt the activity of its thoughts. It wasn't a dried-up well, a pool of stagnant water, nor was it a chaotic state where true and false were confused. Instead, it had a fixed rule and a certain rhythm. It was just in the process of germinating anew and integrating anew. It wasn't just the mental plane. There were some changes and adjustments to its fleshly body. In particular, the area where it had been pierced by the true God's sunlight blade. The cell activity was intense, manifesting itself more clearly. Luo Nan didn't know what would become of it in the end. He had to wait for this. But first he needed to make some arrangements. It was quite scary to just stand there blankly. The battle with the true God just now was short, but it was still quite eye-catching. Luo Nan had already ascertained the situation of the surrounding 100 square kilometers. The few people who had been ejected from the laboratory were all distributed in this area. Perhaps there were some among them who were interested in chasing after him. Speaking of which, Luo Yuan should have left. In the corresponding position, there was only a pile of rotten flesh that was rapidly losing its vitality. And President Wan. Everyone was quite close to each other. Luo Nan did not forget that the reason why his telepathic thoughts had returned to the 70 format laboratory was because of Dean Wan. It was because the wording was highly similar to Dean Wan's cultivation theories. It was related to the lamination interference technique. Maybe he should go up and talk to them? Luo Nan shook his head and opened his personal mailbox. There was a letter that had just been sent. The sender was a bit unfamiliar, but with his grasp of the surrounding wilderness, he naturally knew the true source. Even if he didn't know, he would definitely be able to guess it based on the special words used. This was a set of complex coordinates. It involved the dual positioning of the material plane and the mental plane, and it was described with the unique theoretical logic of the 10,000 towers. Were it not for the fact that Luo Nan often communicated and discussed with him, Luo Nan would have been confused for a while. But right now Luonan was a bit stupefied. Then he let out a sigh of relief. At the end of the day, President Wan was a friend. But how was he supposed to reply? Luonan would feel disgusted if he were to play dumb and make a fuss about nothing, asking how these coordinates came about. But if he were to seamlessly connect the dots and go straight to the main topic, some things would be too troublesome to explain. Since this was the case, Luonan pulled up the information on the lamination interference technique from the virtual brain system. He did a rough scan and opened up the virtual work area over at Ban City. He earnestly used the I secret symbol and began a laborious translation. Dean Wan would certainly be very interested in this information. To return a plum with a peach, everything was left unsaid. Of course there were difficulties in translating. Sometimes he could understand it, but when it was reduced to words, the words wouldn't be able to convey the meaning. He would have to ponder over it endlessly. Luonan decided to work through the night in one spurt of energy. Yinlu had Luonan arrange 3 tasks for her. She was so busy that her feet didn't even touch the ground. Only Snake Tongue served her by her side. The habits of humans were very terrifying. Unconsciously, she had already gotten used to having someone serve her by her side, and Snake Tongue was the best. Luonan remembered that he still needed her to help him with his experiments before. But due to the accident in the laboratory in the wilderness, he had to fly several thousand kilometers away and fight back. But now, he still needed her. At the very least, he could refer to her at any time with the yarn of invisibility. Wouldn't he gain more inspiration? Time had no sense of existence in the face of concentration. Soon it was midnight. Yinlu came back from her business to greet Luonan, but Luonan chased her off to rest. The lighting in the bedroom interweaved with the lighting in the virtual work area. They were all automatically adjusted to the most suitable and stable state. It seemed that they were going to continue like this forever. But at this time, muffled thunder sounded in the night sky of Ban City. Howling winds came at the same time. The wind was quite strong. Even though the yacht had already anchored into the harbor, it still trembled slightly. This was the omen of an impending storm. Snake Tongue, who had been massaging Luonan's shoulders, subconsciously took a deep breath. She didn't know why, but her chest felt a bit stuffy. Luonan's movements paused before she could think deeply. He laughed. A true god has returned. He seems to be in a terrible mood. Snake Tongue's mind was in a muddled state for an instant, but she immediately became alert. She made a quick and sharp connection. Is the Amaterasu Order preparing to restart the project? Who knows? Luonan blurted out without thinking. He lowered his head and continued his translation work. Snake Tongue's gaze focused on Luonan's face. In the end, she lowered her eyelids and continued with her work. Her technique was the same as before. As for what state her mind was in, only she herself knew. No, the Lord beside him must have known as well. Time passed bit by bit. Dark thunder rumbled in Ban City. Dense clouds prevented rain, and the air grew more and more stuffy and dry. Snake Tongue obviously couldn't feel it inside the yacht, but her spirituality was clearly being suppressed and affected on the mental plane. According to the logic of Luonan's words, this was most likely the influence of a true god. Snake Tongue had been in Ban City for many years. She couldn't say that she wasn't used to strange sights, but she still had the ability to accept them. It was just that she was affected by the actions of the Amaterasu Order 2 days ago. It was hard to avoid some divergent considerations. Georgia Wayman was probably shivering in fear. Luonan's voice suddenly cut into her ear. What's the temperament of a true god like? You've been in Ban City for so many years. Do you have some understanding? He's temperamental. He has an explosive temper. If he's a god, then he must be a very vile one. Snake Tongue quickly reacted. She made her own conclusion and evaluation. He's quite in tune with the atmosphere of the divine path in Ban City. Luonan burst out in laughter. Snake Tongue still had a sharp and sinister temperament deep in her bones. His curiosity was piqued and he asked in passing. What about me? My lord. Yes, what about me? Snake Tongue didn't find this strange. Luonan had faintly placed himself on par with a true god's mentality. It was just that this so-called evaluation was close at hand. It would inevitably bring about all sorts of problems. She had no choice but to consider it. After several seconds of silence, Snake Tongue smiled and said, From what I see, my lord really isn't gentle. The language of humans was truly marvelous. Snake Tongue clearly deviated on purpose with craftiness, but it involved the flow of dispersing on the mental plane. She went from a pool of stagnant water to a winding stream in a jungle. The complexity and subtlety of her emotions actually exceeded the scope of Luonan's understanding. Luonan couldn't figure it out for a time. He thought deeper and felt that it was ridiculous. He simply dispelled these distracting thoughts and responded faintly. "Then I'm really sorry." He no longer spoke with snake tongue. He focused on his translation work once more. It was another sleepless night. Chapter 824. Old Hand did not go to the factory today, saying that he was not feeling well. He stayed at home to give himself some time to catch his breath. In fact, his body was indeed slightly injured. Diving 180 meters deep into the water and staying there for a long time, even with the support of his equipment, was too harsh for an old man. He leaned on the sofa, but he was not idle from time to time. His fingers were constantly moving in the virtual workspace, drawing the foundation structure that was formed or not. Shelter. This was a good thing, but the situation outside was very tense. The Soul Order, which had been developing in a low-key manner, suddenly became the target of everyone's curses, and for such an absurd reason. Even from afar, the veteran could smell the scent of a conspiracy. Not to mention whether the Soul Order was innocent or not, how could such a job be passed down? How to learn? It was all a matter of brain power. Some people, once dead, would throw difficult problems at him. His wristband vibrated and a call came in. Seeing the caller ID, Old Hand raised his head but quickly picked up. "Hello, Secretary Yin. Yes, I'm not in the factory. Do you want to continue? Looking for a studio? Looking for me? President Okupin Rong Sang can definitely recommend better than me. I'm not a professional. But if Mr. Mo insists, I can indeed help from a technical point of view. Come over to pick me up? There's no need, right? Alright, I won't stand on ceremony." After the short call ended, Old Hand scratched his gray and white hair. He could not help but wonder, does the Blood Flame Order want to break through from me? Where did I get the face to do so? In any case, Mr. Mo was still quite respectful. Even that arrogant female secretary called him Master Show the next day. Her attitude was very proper. Old Hand fell for it. What was more troublesome was that he had been looking for people too frequently in the past 2 days. His own rhythm had been completely disrupted. Alright, stop the research. Although death is a big deal, life has to continue. Brother, just wait a little longer. Old Hand had seen many life and death situations in the wilderness. Although he did not have a heart of stone, he could still take it easy. He erased all the graphics he had copied and studied in the virtual workspace, tidied up a little, and prepared to deal with it again when he went out. As he was about to leave, he remembered something and dialed a number. 10 seconds later, the other party picked up. The voice was hoarse and tired. "Uncle Shou? Xiaojiang, did you stay up late again?" "It's okay, I'm used to it." Uncle Shou, speak. "Oh, I see." The veteran briefly explained the conversation and asked, "I think that Mr. Mo's attitude is pretty good. It seems like he's sincere about acquiring the company. Today you said you're looking for a studio, but I think it's just an excuse. You still want to talk to us. You're our leader. Why don't we take this opportunity to meet? I'm just here in name to make things easier for everyone. I won't be participating in the specifics. Uncle Shou, you can make the decision." Little Zhang's voice was soft but firm. In the end, she reminded him again, "Of course it's good if we can negotiate, but if we can't, there's no need to force it. After all, Banqing is xenophobic and the trade market is not a good place. We've already crossed the ocean to get here. Why should we care so much?" The veteran was open-minded. The infected people are still resources. They won't be cleared out so quickly, but they won't let go so easily either. Since we've come to Banqing, we probably won't be able to return within a generation. It's good to have a foundation to let everyone settle down. A soft sigh came from the other side. "Uncle Shou, thank you for your trouble. I should be the one thanking you. At this age, I don't have to worry about anything, but I can't help but take care of those bottles and cans, old and young. I can't do it, and it's all thanks to you." "Uncle Shou, I said it a long time ago, this is to repay my conscience. Forget it, let's not talk about this. How are things on your side? Has the ownership of the laboratory been decided?" "Not yet. LRCF has been asking for a long time to buy it all together. It's been more than half a year, and they still haven't come to an agreement. Are they waiting for the Great Zay Church to collapse so that they can directly collect the trash? From a long-term legal perspective, LRCF's current investment and funding model will be less troublesome. But if there is a clear direction and we try to advance the project faster, it will be more efficient to integrate. I really want to know their direction. But looking at the situation in Banshing, if we wait a little longer, collecting trash might also be a good business. Veteran laughed out loud, but in the end he couldn't laugh anymore. Banshing was in turmoil, and ordinary people like them, especially the living assets, who were detained on this piece of land, wouldn't have an easy time. Jianghu was right, the peaceful trade market wasn't a good place. To put it bluntly, buying property here was just to create a beautiful bubble, to comfort the people. The call ended. Veteran sighed, patted his clothes, and went out. During the day, the peaceful trade market was centered around the trading center, and the prosperity radiated outwards, gradually decreasing. When he arrived at Veteran's nest in Linshan, it was already very quiet. Most of the people went to work or to do business, and the entire residential area seemed empty, which was more in line with the traditional style of Banshing. Veteran stood on the side of the street, waiting for Secretary Yin to come over. He was old and he didn't have a good rest last night, so he couldn't help but yawn again. At this time, from the corner of his eye, he saw a high-end black MPV approaching from the opposite side of the street. In this residential area, there were fewer such vehicles, so he thought it was Secretary Yin's car, so he turned his head and took a few more glances. At this time he received another call. I'm on the side of the road and I saw. Hey, you guys haven't arrived yet? No, don't worry, I saw wrong. Oh yes, it's here. As he spoke, the black MPV that he had mistaken for slowly drove past him. Coincidentally, a similar black MPV drove over from the corner of the street a little further away, and the two cars passed each other on the relatively narrow street. Later, this car stopped next to Veteran. Lu deliberately got out of the car to formally greet Veteran, and helped him open the door of the main compartment. Veteran saw Mr. Mo smiling at him from inside the compartment, and his wheelchair was placed next to him. Previously, Secretary Yin didn't mention that her boss was also coming over. Unexpectedly, the Veteran was a little overwhelmed by the unexpected favor. If one was unaccountably solicitous, one would definitely have ulterior motives. Could it be used here? Hundreds of thoughts flashed through his mind, but he didn't delay. He bent over to get into the car and said with a smile, "You guys are too polite. It's what I should do." Mr. Mo invited Veteran to sit next to him in the guest seat and said in a soft voice, "I'm going to stay in Ban City for a while, but my mind isn't idle. It's very important for me to have a suitable workshop to try some things out. I'm very grateful that Master Shou can help me." "You're too kind. If you don't find it to your liking, please don't be angry." Mr. Mo smiled again. His smile rarely had the sophistication of an adult, but it made his face, which didn't show much of his age, look even younger. Veteran couldn't figure out what kind of person this person was, and what kind of personality he had. In any case, he was a professional. Veteran had seen many businessmen, but he had never seen someone like Mr. Mo, who entered the factory as soon as he came, and found a workshop to do experiments within 2 days. Lu also got into the car and sat in the front passenger seat. She turned her head and asked Veteran, "Master Shou, where should we go first? How about going to Jitakucho to pick up someone? I have an apprentice who used to work in customer service, but now he's in business. He's more familiar with the market than I am." Of course. The car started again. Mr. Mo looked through the window and sized up the street. "Master Shou's residence is very quiet, but it's a bit remote. How's the peace trade market?" "Well, I can only say it's okay. You also know that there are a lot of immigrants here. We vagrants from the wilderness as well as modified humans can't have a get-together every day." "I see. Mr. Mo, if you're more concerned about this, I'll take it into consideration. In fact, as long as it's a good workshop that can be rented, it's filled with expensive things, and the location is quite particular." Mr. Mo smiled and didn't say anything. The car drove away from the street. And just half a minute later, another black commercial car that had just driven past Veteran's place turned around and came back. This car looked like a business car on the outside, but the space inside was stingy and full of equipment and personnel. Only the main and front passenger seats were spacious. At this moment, the man with a crew cut in the front passenger seat was giving orders. "Team 3, go in. Follow Supervisor Bai's instructions and do a good job. Don't rummage around like you're doing a forced search. We haven't reached that stage yet." As a frontline commander, his instructions were too long, and his lazy attitude had already affected his subordinates. Someone asked, "Captain Jimmy, how long will that stage take?" Go ask our beautiful Supervisor Bai." Captain Jimmy watched as the members of Team 3 sneaked into the suspect Veteran's house and put down the intercom. Suddenly, he thought of something and turned his head, his gaze stopping at the back half of the main car. Perhaps you can also ask our honorable Mr. Neo. Come, use your brain and contribute a little more to the real world. At the end of Captain Jimmy's line of sight was a man in a hospital gown. His body was perfectly straight, but in fact he was firmly confined by magnetic rings. At the same time, 7 or 8 tubes of different thicknesses were inserted into his mouth, nostrils, and even the skin on the back of his neck. They went up to his brain, and the ends were connected to the equipment on the side. This Mr. Neo had a blank expression, but the various electric signals extracted from his body formed a rather effective stream of information. A large number of blurry and shaky images were displayed in a specific projection area. There were some relatively clear figures inside, and they were constantly changing, including veteran. Chapter 825. The middleman that veteran introduced to Mr. Emo was a young man named Wu Li. He had a dark complexion and was as thin as a stick. At first glance, he looked like someone who was malnourished or a long-term drug addict. However, his eyes were bright, his steps were light, and his mind was fast. He only communicated with Mr. Emo for a few times before he figured out Mr. Mo's pulse. Although the workplace he chose was not satisfactory, it was still quite good. In more than an hour they had gone to 3 locations. Mr. Emo did not feel annoyed, at least on the surface. Next was the 4th location. Veteran had joined in the fun earlier, but he gradually felt sorry. He pulled Wu Li to the side and whispered in his ear, "Do you have any idea? He is not good at walking. You can't do anything from top to bottom." Wu Li grinned, "Master, Mr. Emo has a beautiful secretary to serve him. What is there to do? What he needs, however, should be a high-end, well-equipped place that is quiet and able to withstand the torment. He is an expert. Practicality is the most important thing. Hee master, you are an old man. You have never fought a rich battle in your life. Moreover, you are a technician and he is a boss. Your way of thinking is definitely different. I think Mr. Mo entered the workplace because he wants more inspiration. He doesn't care about the form or the process. In short, he was a money-burning boss." Wu Li did not finish his words, but veteran saw through him. He scratched the back of Wu Li's head, telling him to restrain himself. It was not right to say that Wu Li was cheating. He just kept hinting that there was a better choice than this one. He took advantage of Mr. Mo's high requirements for equipment and insensitivity to price, and raised his psychological threshold bit by bit to enjoy a higher premium. After getting back into the business car, veteran apologized on behalf of Wu Li. Although Mr. Emo did not say anything, it was good to make it clear in advance. Moreover, veteran vaguely felt that Mr. Emo was a person with clear eyes and a clear heart. His disciples' thoughts might not be hidden from him, but Mr. Emo was magnanimous and did not care. The more it was like this, the more he had to lower his attitude. Mr. Emo laughed, "It's okay. I don't care about going to a few more locations. I just want to find a suitable working environment to deal with technical problems. You can say that I am looking for inspiration." Wu Li, who was in the back seat, immediately hid his head in the waist of his trousers. The veteran turned around and glared at him. But judging from Mr. Mo's expression, he really didn't care. Mr. Mo really knows what he's doing, and he's standing at a higher position than us. He's also more knowledgeable, and he's a person who needs to expand, he said with a smile. "No, for now, I'm only doing some technical conversion work. Whether it's looking for a workshop or buying a factory, it's all in service of this goal." "I see." It was true that he was looking for a private workshop today, but it would be too pretentious to say that he didn't want to talk about the acquisition at all. The veteran took the opportunity to add some weight to his side. "Let's not talk about anything else. Half of the people in the factory came from the wilderness of the old continent. They've been with me since they were young. They've also been through wind and rain. They're different from those cowardly Osaka people who only know how to dawdle. I brought it from the wilderness. It's direct and durable. Strong hands-on ability." Wu Li tried to make up for his mistake by concluding at the end. "Top-notch material processing. I've seen it." Mr. Emo was referring to the visit to the factory the night before yesterday. The veteran didn't want to mention that because the young lads in the assembly workshop used some of the techniques of the shelter to form a highly effective synergy. The infiltration and death of the miner made him know that the situation outside was tense, so he didn't want to complicate things. Also, he's smart. Wu Li is a bit off topic. In fact, a really smart person should learn the craft honestly. Wu Li had long been trained to be thick-skinned. He only pretended to be a little embarrassed, and then he followed his master and echoed, "The senior and junior brothers in the factory are really smart. Let's not talk about anything else. In the normal trade market, our subdatabase questions have the highest adoption rate." Mr. Mo didn't know what was going on. At this time Yin Lu, who was sitting in the passenger seat, turned around and explained, "The subdatabase questions that Wu Li mentioned should be referring to the external questions of the credit rating system of the Vagrant Exchange, right?" Yes. Wu Li nodded like he was pounding garlic. Mr. Mo seemed to understand a bit. "Is it the credit rating system that rewards activation points? So it turns out that the above question banks can be accessed externally?" The veteran was slightly startled. These words sounded a bit childish. He subconsciously lowered his judgment of Mr. Mo's age by a level. Wu Li didn't think too much about the latter part. He took out a simple tablet from his bag and directly handed it over. "Swipe the question board. Many of our designs are on it. Our factory takes up nearly 20 of the top 100 pre-database questions." Luo Nan took the so-called swipe the question board. The endless stream of new toys made him feel that it was getting harder and harder to maintain his persona as Mr. Mo. Right now it was time for Yin Lu to play her role. She explained the background knowledge to Luo Nan. The normal trade market of Ban City was essentially a blood-sucking market built on the periphery of the Vagrant Exchange. It was a place where the large amount of black goods circulating in the Vagrant Exchange were legally laundered. The two formed a concentric structure. The inner Vagrant Exchange still strictly adhered to its internal rules. Only black market currency was circulated. There was only an official exchange rate that could be exchanged with all sorts of currencies in the outside world. For example, credits from the secular world, honor points from the inner world, and so on. But the normal trade market on the periphery provided a variety of forms. It bypassed the Vagrant Exchange channel to realize a more flexible and convenient transaction mode. One was relatively fixed, while the other fluctuated rapidly. The exchange itself was a benefit. Plus, this place was an important transfer base for the raw materials of marine aberrations. There was also a half-black half-white experimental base for infected aberrations. Naturally, this place became an important source of income for the government of Ban City. It was also the best place to launder large amounts of money. And the black market currency was an important leverage. It was in high demand. Many specialized professions and products revolved around this. The swipe the question board was one of them. Due to the Vagrant Exchange's credit rating system, it gave every participant the opportunity to obtain a certain amount of black market currency for free. Many people relied on the system to swipe questions, unceasingly increasing their level and evaluation. They obtained black market currency to exchange. But every time they logged into the system it was a test. If they failed the test again and again, their evaluation would be damaged. So some people thought of an idea. They used the method of ants moving houses to gradually transfer the credit test question bank out. They integrated it into the so-called swipe the question board to be used for daily practice. Although the questions in the question bank were as vast as the sea, there were always traces to follow for each profession. If they swiped a few times, they would have a bit of an impression of each question. Then, with a bit of luck, it was possible to jump 2 or 3 levels above their actual level. The higher the level, the more privileges one could enjoy in the Vagrant Exchange. In a certain sense, it wasn't something that could be measured by a few points. They're persuading people to make progress by swiping questions. Luo Nan gasped in amazement at the imagination of the people of Ban City. But what the hell was the external question bank and the advanced question bank? It seriously lacked a sense of design, and it was almost identical to the system interface in Spring City. It could be considered one of the most simple ones he had seen in recent years. The other was the 100-year sequence test interface. It was this simple interface that formed a sharp contrast with the rich content. Luo Nan chose the direction of mechanical design, which he had tried before. What followed was different from last time. There was an additional level, and there were 3 options on top of it: combat simulation, unlimited questions, and browse index. He could roughly guess the meaning. Luo Nan first switched to the index interface. He had a general understanding of the question bank structure. Then he chose the infinite swipe question mode. He let the questions in the question bank appear one after another in the form of a waterfall. The operation was designed to be immersive. Regardless of whether the question was being answered or not, it could be switched infinitely. There was also a drop-down function, which was considered more user-friendly. Luonan casually switched to the questions on the swipe question board. He looked as he evaluated. His foundation in mechanical design was laid down by worker Zhai. He was more academic, and his design ideas were influenced by the virtual brain system. He used configuration thinking as a key link, and he had a myriad of experiences. Overall, his design was quite high-end. Now that he didn't have the pressure of a test, it was easier to form an overall impression by quickly browsing through the question bank. The questions on the swipe question board were clearly divided into two types. One type was the questions from the original question bank, or the questions that were similar in style. Regardless of the difficulty, they were relatively rigorous. They also tended to be practical. Some were even relatively old-fashioned. As for the other type, thanks to the creator of the swipe question board, there was a built-in ranking and filtering function. Luonan adjusted it to the premium recommendation level. Only then did he feel that the questions that appeared weren't as painful to the eyes. Luonan hurriedly flipped through a few pages before he finally gave his evaluation. Deviant. Difficult. Dangerous. Strange. Very eye-catching but very interesting. Old Hand had just freed himself from his complex emotions when he gave Luonan a thumbs up. His meaning was that Luonan had hit the nail on the head. Luonan smiled at him. These newly created questions on the swipe question board, even if they were of an extremely high level, weren't necessarily rigorous. They were more imaginative and bold. And the mode of setting questions for others to do carried a certain sense of flaunting. This way, the train of thought of the person who set the questions would be exposed more clearly. What was being tested, what was being hidden, what was being flaunted, and what was the core of the questions could be discerned with a single glance. Luonan swept his gaze over and felt that he had a basic understanding of the overall style of mechanical design in Ban City. If he were to ponder deeply and extract a few processing techniques, it wouldn't be a problem. Oh, if he were to expand the scope. He removed the restriction of mechanical design and the amount of information suddenly exploded. Within the domain of the vagrant exchange, there were still topics related to distortion, alteration, biochemistry, and even supernatural powers. They were more common. Luonan even had the misconception that he was now an expert in the study of marine distortion species around Ban City. From hunting and gathering, to processing and processing, to design and manufacture, to practical use, all sorts of information was available. This was simply a database of distortion species in a region. Ban City was like this. If it was as Lu said, then the 88 large metropolitan areas of the world were like this. Luonan understood Old Hand's meaning. Only an idiot would let go of such a rich resource of information. Speaking of which, Luonan seemed to have heard someone mention something similar before. He had some memories of this in his mind. Luonan couldn't recall it for a while, but he didn't force it. He switched the page to the ranking list of physics and specifically asked Old Hand, "Who are they?" Wu Li blinked his eyes at his master and pointed them out to Luonan one by one with excitement. Xuanhuan 7 tribes. Your unified logo? Luonan keenly discovered that the people who came up with the questions that Wu Li was referring to all wore this logo after their IDs were verified. You could say that. Wu Li grinned. His mood was clearly affected. It was Old Hand who explained, the tribe used to be mainly active in the vicinity of the Xuanhuan mountain range. After they moved to Ban City, they were divided into this order. The Xuanhuan mountain range? Near Spring City? Luonan suddenly asked. Old Hand chuckled. I've stayed in the vicinity before. But it's normal for the tribe to move back and forth. They've been to the basin, they've been to the plateau. There's no set number. Luonan went, oh. He didn't continue to get entangled on this topic. He decided to go through the dozens of self-created questions on the ranking list in more detail. During this time, the car had already reached its destination. Luonan didn't care. In any case, he didn't even need to move a finger. Lu could serve him comfortably. Wu Li winked at his master again and received another slap from Old Hand. This time it was a slap to the back of his head. Wu Li grimaced and moved to the front of Luonan's wheelchair. He cleared his throat and began to introduce the workshop and its surrounding environment. This used to be a small-scale Frost River reality branch store. I quite like to come here to play. But after 2 years it couldn't hold on any longer, so I sold it. I partitioned it into a professional workshop like this one and rented it out. Many manufacturers do their after-sales maintenance here. Of course, most of the goods sold in the trade market aren't consumer goods. There are very few idle people here. It can be considered a quiet place amidst the noise. Frost River reality? Luonan raised his gaze from the question board. You seem to be deep in thought. It's rare for a Frost River Reality Branch store to not be able to continue operating in the world. It was rare for Lu to express her opinion. It was probably because of her previous experience as an executive of Frost River Reality's flagship store. Wu Li responded with a chuckle. In the end, the trade district isn't the CBD. Everyone is working during the day. It's normal for them to work at night. Adults who trade their lives for money, who would have the leisure to come here every day. Plus, the machines are easy to break and the fees are crazy expensive. Old Hand glared at him. You guys fight here every day. You think you're in the right? Get to the point. Luonan had just woken up from his daze. The familiar feeling from before should be from Frost River Reality. Indeed, it should be from one of the games. He turned to look at Lu. Your previous project, 10 Days in the Wilderness, should have the corresponding data to support it. Lu was startled for a moment before she said, definitely. A large-scale reality game like 10 Days in the Wilderness requires a massive amount of real-world data. She understood Luonan's meaning when she spoke to this point. She turned to smile at Wu Li. Maybe you guys contributed to it. Wu Li was embarrassed and speechless. That's right. The virtual reality technology of the Frost River Waterway was able to perfectly integrate into the archetype format's training mode. This made Luonan very amazed, but he was also very unwilling to accept it. He had once asked Yuan for some understanding. The specific details were a bit blurry. He only remembered the gist of it. According to what she said, there were many major powers from all over the world that were providing technical support for the Frost River Reality project. In terms of big data, all sorts of channels were used to collect real-time information from all over the world. They were transmitted, updated, categorized, analyzed, and processed at all times. The question board was small, and the questions were intermingled with good and bad ones. But as long as they were collected online with the support of enormous computing power and algorithms, large amounts of unstructured and semi-structured data could be effectively organized. A considerable portion of the data could even be reintegrated into a complete data model and be fully utilized. The Frost River Waterway was a virtual reality game. It was developed by many parties and there were military and political forces involved. This was the root of the game. Humanity's counterattack against the mutants on all fronts in recent years was absolutely not due to the appearance of the deep blue platform. This was an enormous and orderly accumulation. It was an inevitable process from quantitative change to qualitative change. There was no doubt that this information was not free. It was more or less in the hands of several powers. Through complex cross-licensing, limited and paid sharing was realized. How salivating, Luonan sighed. Suddenly, the external neuron began to tremble. A pop-up window popped up on the virtual brain interface. Do you want to import? You're tuning in to the Sworddance in the Vast Sky YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.